Now let's go back to Germany and the UK and wherever you are. I think you're a pretty international law company. One of the two favorite law companies of this conference called Osborne Clarke, represented by a partner called Carsten Schneider, with a very interesting story for you.
Thank you, Jan, and welcome to this afternoon session. Thank you very much for allowing us to give a little presentation to you. Let me introduce you to Osborne Clarke real quick. Also, because we have news to spread, we just opened our 14th office yesterday, actually in Brussels. So we're pretty much across Europe and with also outposts in the US, particularly in Silicon Valley. What we're doing is all sort of commercial law advice with a focus on technologies, and that brings us to energy and clean tech. The government is not always supportive to us, as we all know, but in this very case, it has helped me a lot to come up with a special topic for this presentation, because it was only 2 weeks ago that the German government introduced a new scheme of subsidies for private investors into technology-driven companies, or as they call it, innovative companies. And I thought that would be a nice one for today's session. It is against the background that German government has been pushed to come up with sort of a tax benefit scheme, as you would know it from the UK. But for various reasons, mainly political reasons, was reluctant to introduce that. And now, as a sort of compromise and very much under the observation of the European Commission for giving subsidies to German companies, it has now introduced a public subsidy grant to private investors for new investments into technology-driven companies of at least of 20%, which is not bad, and we'll come to the details in a minute. But it's a 150 million subsidy fund sponsored by the German government, or sponsored by the German Minister for Economic Affairs. So that's a good start, and we can encourage you to apply heavily to get these grants. What I would like to do is run you quickly through the process of application for this grant, which will help you get a feel for whether that is an option for you, either from an investor's perspective, or from a company's perspective, or from a VC's perspective for co-investment purposes, say. The application process is a twofold one. It involves a governmental body, which is a governmental office, basically, which is called BAFA, which is usually an office in charge of export controls, like when you want to export weapons to nowhere. Then you will run through BAFA, and for whatever reason, they found that this is the right office to deal with this public grant, and they have now sort of set up a website, which you see at BAFA.de, where you can apply for this subsidy. And it's a twofold application process, because it involves an application by the startup company, sort of to get a confirmation, a kind of certificate, that it qualifies for investors to apply for such a subsidy. And then the investor's own application, because it is essentially the investor who is an applicant for this subsidy and who can receive the subsidy rather than the company itself. There are certain requirements, and I only want to touch on a few. It has to be a rather young company. It doesn't have to be a larger company, certainly not listed. For you coming from an international background, it's kind of interesting that it doesn't have to be a company registered in Germany, but it needs to have a branch office active in Germany so that it qualifies for that grant. In a first step, the company hands in an application to prove that it is an innovative company that goes by a certain list of, or kind of directory of industries where this would be checked. Then the BAFA grants this certificate. And then within an expiry period of 6 months' time, the investor has to file its or his or her own application for an investment which has to be a new investment. So the investor must be a new investor to that company, must not be involved for new shares given by against fresh money. And once the BAFA has taken its decision to grant this public subsidy, it will be 20% of an invest. For small monies, like 10,000 invest, would be a 2,000 subsidy. And then with 2 thresholds and caps, where not more than 200K would be granted per year per startup, and where not more than a maximum of 250K would be the investment to qualify, because no individual investor would get more than 50K per year as a subsidy, but it's kind of money. Now, as I said, usually it's the startup to file the application first, and then the investor comes in. There is one exception to that rule where the investor, the new investor that comes to that company, is one of the founders. The application process is the other way around. So the investor would file its application first, and then within an expiry period of normally 3 months, in case of milestones in the investment contract, that can be extended to 15 months. And then the startup company would follow with its own application. Now, when we look at these things from an advisor's perspective, we of course ask ourselves, what would be the impact on investments, and certainly on shareholders' agreements and whatever have you. And I think one of the questions to raise is, what will be the impact of a startup or other investors knowing that there is a new investor coming in who will get a 20% subsidy from the government? Will this have an impact on discussions when it comes to valuation of companies? Yeah. To make an example, if there's a round B investment where there are 2 investors coming in, one is an existing investor, one is a new investor, will it be accepted by the company and will it be accepted by the existing investor that the new investor comes in at same terms, knowing that he or she will get a 20% subsidy, or will it rather be sort of a request by the other parties involved that this 20% subsidy goes into the company on top? Shares must be fully risk-bearing, so there are certain restrictions on risk reduction as you would normally find it in the shareholders' agreements. And last but not least, there's a 3-year holding period, and that could cause actually some difficulties for early exit scenarios. Plus, it is the investor who bears the risk that the company later on disqualifies for the subsidy. And our guess is that this will have to be displayed in the shareholders' agreements from now on to sort of socialize the risk of the investor to have to repay the subsidy that has been granted at the beginning of the investment. So there will be some changes to shareholders' agreements, investment agreements, resulting from this new grant. But on the other hand side, it's quite attractive, given that 20% is kind of an amount that's worth thinking about. Okay, that's about it. Happy to take any questions.
Great. Very well explained. Do you have actually a question? Christian? Also called Hodge. Wait for the microphone. You have ex-microphone runner.
Thank you. Thank you for the input. Does that apply for companies who already have approved to be innovative and have gotten the BAFA funding, for example, for fairs, exhibitions? One question. And second question, how do you see the perspective? What will this do? Why did they do that? How is the VC scene discussing this? Mm-hmm. What's the reflection? Thank you.
I think the reflection is really interesting. As I said, it was introduced, and you could apply, the first day you could apply for that grant was 15 May, so it's a bit more than 2 weeks ago. And the BAFA has already received 147 or so applications within those first 14 days, 2 weeks. And it has, and that's the nice one, to spread. It has approved 35 within the 35 applications coming in from startup companies within the first 2 weeks. So there's our concern was that this process would be an extremely long process or lengthy process, simply because it's such a governmental office and they wouldn't even know what to do with it. But it could be the good thing that they have absolutely no clue about investment contracts and what have you. They've never seen that before. We spoke to the people and they say, well, we're completely new to this whole venture capital or whatever it is, and we desperately need workshops on this. So we rather sign off the applications as they come in, and that's actually the purpose. So we expect that to kick off very well. And that monies will be released fairly quickly. Applications can be made until the end of 2016, so that's sort of the date set for the first 150 million, but we expect this to be spent by mid-next year. And the first question, I didn't really understand completely. If there are applications in place already? Oh, right, okay. So no, that's no harm. That doesn't disqualify the company if there are other public subsidies. Because what I said is it's a financial support that is given to the new investor rather than to the company. But it will be probably a marketing tool of the companies to say, well, we are qualified by BAFA to get this grant.
But maybe I missed it, but this public subsidy is really for angels, isn't it?
Yeah, it's an angel.
Because of the amount of money, it is really an angel thing. And I think angels are playing a very important role. They should be playing a more important role in clean tech. Yeah, I think there are too few clean tech angels around. I think there's one in the room, or maybe two.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's the purpose of the whole scheme, to encourage business angels to go and invest in technology-driven startups. Absolutely.
Do you know why they decided for 20%? Is this a cool number? Is it uncool?
Hard to say. It's. I don't know. In the end, it will have fiscal reasons to say, well, what can we afford? How many companies do we want to support by an amount that we can convince the Minister of Finance to allocate to this scheme in the end? And 150 million, if you make it too big tickets or too high subsidies, then you won't reach a greater number of business angels.
Great. Thank you very much, Carsten.